On behalf of everybody here at St. Boniface, we want to welcome everybody who may be visiting for the weekend, as well as all of our brothers and sisters who may be here from our neighboring parishes, especially this weekend, as it's our first weekend of our new grouping, different Mass times. Thank all of you for your graciousness and patience with all of us priests, Father Mark, Father John, and myself, as we all go through this period of transition. Our first weekend of our new grouping, we're reminded in the Gospel today of just how biblical is this model of having two priests together serving several communities. We read at the beginning of the Gospel that at that time, Jesus appointed 72 others whom he sent ahead of him in pairs to every house and town that he intended to visit. So after calling his 12 apostles, which we could see as being the beginning of the bishops that we have today, he then appointed other men, 72 others, to go to every place that he would visit. And so we could see in those 72 kind of the priests that we have today, sent to many places that, as it says, that Jesus desired to visit. So Jesus desires to visit our places, especially through the sacraments, especially through the Mass and his presence in the Eucharist. We know that as we go through these changes, it can be difficult, but even with so many things that we have to get used to, I am convinced of one thing specifically, that wherever I go, however my assignment changes as a priest, I know that wherever I am, I will find God's faithful people there. And my experience has been just like that of the 72, that they entered many of the towns that welcomed them. They found, just as Jesus said, that when we welcome Jesus, then we find all the wonderful works that he'll do for us. And the 72 at the end of the Gospel come back rejoicing as they see evil being overcome by great good in God's works. It's only when someone doesn't welcome him, Jesus says, that he instructs the ministers to go on. As God never forces himself upon us, but leaves us completely free to accept him. When we welcome him, his peace comes upon us. Jesus in this gospel also notes one of the main reasons why not only our parishes, but many of the parishes throughout our diocese has had to go through this grouping rearrangement this summer. He says that the harvest is abundant, but the laborers are few. So think about that. The harvest is abundant. Isn't that good news? Isn't that what we wish we could say every single year in fall? That the harvest this year, it's abundant. Jesus, of course, in this is speaking of a crop even more valuable than what we find out in our fields. Jesus is speaking about you, about me, about all people across the whole world. That the harvest of souls is abundant, that he wants to bring to him, to be with him in heaven. But Jesus then says that the laborers are few. And that's not so good news. To have an abundant crop in the field, think of that, but not to be able to get it out because of whatever reason it might be. To have to leave the corn and the beans there in the field to rot because you don't have enough time or not enough help or the weather isn't right, whatever reason it might be. But that's precisely the issue at hand, Jesus says. The laborers are few. There's an abundance of souls that need to reach heaven, but so few willing to help them reach it. These laborers, of course, are first the 12 and then the 72, which means the bishops and the priests. And we can definitely see that there are fewer laborers today, right? Even in this year in our diocese, we have 9 retirements, but only 1 ordination to replace them. The laborers are few. So sometimes people will ask, why are there so few? What do we do so that we can have more priests? And some people will propose all sorts of different ideas as to how to increase their numbers. Like asking the older priest to just keep on going. Or saying, well, we can just bring in priests from other places and have them come. Or even drastically changing the way God has set up the priesthood to try to entice other people to be priests. But all of those ideas ultimately fail because they ignore what Jesus says in the gospel today as to where priests come from. So listen, the harvest is abundant, but the laborers are few. So ask the master of the harvest to send out laborers for his harvest. Ask the master of the harvest. This is the key, to ask God. Because where do priests come from? Well, God calls them. And that's why all these other ideas will never ever work. Because they're all about trying to change things, to try to get people to do it. But that's not how God works. He calls. There's no priest that we have who chose himself to be a priest. I had no inkling of being a priest before, when I was in college, that I finally began paying attention to God and asking him, what do you want me to do? And then I could finally hear what his plan was for me. So where do priests come from? God is the one who calls. And who is it that he's going to call? Where do they come from? Sometimes people wonder why, the diocese doesn't do more to promote vocations. But the reality is that priests don't come from the bishop. They come from families and parishes like yours. The men who are priests, the young men who are in our seminaries right now, they come from parishes and families like our own. Father Mark, Father John, myself, all of us grew up in Nebraska. I was just, down the road, not far. Howells, grew up on the farm. That's where so many of our current and our future priests will come from. Each parish, in a sense, is almost indebted to all other parishes for the priests that we have today. Our parish, and a lot of our parishes, can look back with pride in the past priests that have come from our parishes. So do we think that God stopped calling? That he doesn't do that anymore? Or is it that maybe the way we live, or even the world around us, has made it difficult for our sons to hear? The harvest is abundant, but the laborers are few. Yes, in comparison with the abundance of souls, God does call relatively few men to be priests. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't provide enough laborers. No, because there are laborers who are not priests. And that is all of you. Every single one of us is called to be a laborer for God. In fact, the church is made up mostly of non-priests among its ranks, of those who are called to go and harvest souls and bring them to him. So that's why, as priests, we are absolutely dependent upon each one of you to take part in that, to help us who are few with the many, so that all souls may be brought to him. And I don't primarily mean just, your roles of assisting at Mass or being part of committees. Those are, of course, very good, and we're glad that you do that. But we can even see in there where it's difficult sometimes to get volunteers. But really, the greater labor is just the sharing and the witnessing of the faith to others. Parents, for example, especially dads, to witness to your children. And just think about how much easier later in their life they will be able to listen to God's call if it's already being promoted within your family. Also, whatever person you may meet at your work, throughout your day, throughout your week, those are people that we as priests may never see, may never talk to. There may be somebody you know that would be absolutely uncomfortable talking to a priest, but because you have a connection with them, they'd be willing to talk to you. And at some point, there may be a moment where you can share, this is what the Lord means to me. Ask the master of the harvest to send out laborers for his harvest. So we must pray for vocations. Pray for the young men that God might be calling to be priests. To ask him to bring forth those men from our parishes and from our families. But also to ask God to make clear what is your role. And that's my prayer, that all of our parishes and our grouping will be full of laborers, willing to bring the good news of Jesus Christ to every place in our communities. To ask of him, Lord, what do you want me to do? For when we welcome him in that way, what wonders he will do for us.